Hello, today we are going to discuss John Millington Synge's one-act play, Riders to the Sea. Synge was born in 1871 and he died in 1909. He was one of the co-founders of the Abbey Theatre. His most successful and controversial play, Playboy of the Western World, caused riots in Dublin. He founded the Irish National Theatre Society in the year 1896 in collaboration with Yeats, Lady Gregory, and George William Russell. His meeting with the famous poet William Butler Yeats in 1896 proved to be a turning point in his literary career. Yeats advised Synge to go visit the Aran Islands off the western coast of Ireland, and Synge visited these islands for the next 5 summers. Riders to the Sea came to be written as a direct consequence of Synge's experience on the Aran Islands. Previously, in 1901, Synge had published a book-length journal based on the collection of folklores and stories that he had collected from the Aran Islands, which was published in 1901. Synge believed that beneath the Catholic faith of the Irish fishermen on the Aran Islands, there lay a substratum of much older pagan beliefs and systems, and this is a belief that comes across clearly in Riders to the Sea, in the way in which he explores the themes of life and death and grief. Riders to the Sea was written in 1902 and was performed at Molesworth Hall, Dublin in 1904. It is part of the dramatic revival that characterized the Irish literary renaissance that took place at the turn of the 20th century. Riders to the Sea is an example of the literary output of a tradition of literary nationalism that was going on at the turn of the 20th century in Ireland, in which writers and poets looked back on the traditional native Gaelic traditions of Ireland and of its pre-colonial past. They used old folklores, stories, myths, and artistic forms that dated back to the pre-colonial history of Ireland. Synge's experiences on the Aran Islands directly influenced his writing of Riders to the Sea. Though the play is written in prose, in terms of the economy of expression and the symbolic richness that the playwright achieves through the use of minimalistic objects and characters, it qualifies as poetic drama. Each word, each action, and each object on stage suggests more than it shows, and this is how poetry also works, as a result of which Riders to the Sea can be called poetic drama. It is a one-act tragedy set in an unnamed island off the western coast of Ireland. It is far removed from the urbanizing influences of Dublin that were commonly represented in the literatures of the time. The play itself has the quality of a classical tragedy in which space and time have been compressed dramatically on stage to represent a single event of momentous tragic import in the life of a single family. This is the kind of unity, the unities of space, time and action that classical Greek and Roman playwrights followed and Aristotle prescribed. The events described in the play refer to the tragic incident in the life of a single family, and they deal with the theme of human suffering, death, grief and loss. With its use of a minimalistic cast, a very few props and a variety of symbolic objects and actions on stage, the play almost has a lyrical quality. The language spoken by the characters in the play is also very distinct and different from the standard English spoken by characters in canonical works of British literature. The action itself represents an incident, represents themes that are symbolically rich and suggestive. The atmosphere and the theme presents a view of life that is closely attuned to the elemental forces that govern human existence and is related to fundamental questions of loss, suffering, grief and death. These features qualify Riders to the Sea as poetic drama. The play begins with the entrance of Nora on stage, who has brought a bundle of clothes that have been retrieved from a corpse that was washed up ashore in the northern place of Donegal. Nora and Kathleen, her sister, are worried that the clothes might belong to brother Michael, who has been missing on sea for 9 days. They speak in hushed tones because they're worried they might wake up Moria, their mother, who has been distraught at the loss of a son. They're also worried because the young priest has refused to stop Bartley, their only surviving son of the family, to go to Connemara to sell a horse at the Galway fair. Moria now enters the stage, looking very disturbed and distraught, and she inquires after Bartley, who is still absent. Soon enough, Bartley also enters the stage, and Moria entreats him to not go to Galway fair because she is certain he is going to meet the same fate as his dead brothers. She says that his presence will be required to make the coffin and dig up the grave when Michael's body is recovered. To all her entreaties, Bartley offers only a cold silence. He issues instructions to his sisters, Kathleen and Nora, about the domestic duties they are supposed to carry on in his absence. Moria is almost certain now that Bartley is going to die on sea as well, and makes the same prediction. Almost as soon as Bartley leaves, Kathleen and Nora remember that they had forgotten to give him the loaf of bread they had been baking for his journey. Kathleen entreats Moria to go after him, meet him midway, and give him the bread and her blessing. When Moria leaves, Nora and Kathleen examine the bundle of clothes and realize that they did indeed belong to Michael, their brother. They are now sure that Michael is dead, and soon enough, Moria also returns, declaring that she has had the most frightful vision. Moria says that she has seen Bartley's red mare being followed by Michael on a grey pony. She is now absolutely certain that Bartley is going to die as well. Soon enough, the lamenting villagers come with Bartley's body into the cottage. They tell their family that Bartley was knocked off his red mare by the grey pony into the sea, and therefore he met his end. The play ends with a release of dramatic tension, with Moria declaring, "No man at all can be living forever, and we must be satisfied." The major theme of the play is human suffering in the face of unassailable, impersonal forces of nature, explored here by means of representing the lives of the poor fishermen and peasants living on the Aran Islands. This is explored by means of the daily struggle for survival that the play represents. The Aran Islanders depend on the sea for sustenance. It's a source of life, but it also, at the same time, takes life after life with frightening regularity. It symbolizes the actual risk of death that the islanders face on a daily basis. The eternal conflict between life and death is represented by means of a single tragic episode in the life of one family on stage in terms of action that takes place just within a span of few hours. While the grim material reality of the lives of Moria and her family is represented by means of the ways in which they economize everything, turf, livestock, rope, cloth, the immeasurable forces of nature that surround them in the form of the sea make it impossible for them to calculate the actual risk of death. Thus, Kathleen and Nora's attempt to rationalize Michael's death in terms of distance and time seems very tragically inadequate in the face of the inevitability of death that Moria's presentiments and fears represent. In fact, human loss and suffering seem to have little meaning in the face and in the context of the larger unfathomable setting of the play, as the sea claims life after life with frightening regularity. Thus, when Moria recites at the end of the play the names of all the sons that she has lost to the sea, it almost sounds like an incantation, a litany. When Bartley's body is brought in, Moria is recounting a similar incident when a son of hers had died, and it's almost as though the play itself represents visually on stage an incident that is recorded in the past in Moria's memory, but also unfolding at the same time on stage. The fearful, timeless, repetitious occurrence of death, of tragedy in the lives of these people represents, in more general terms, the individual suffering and grief that is of a larger communal import in the lives of the Aran Islanders. The unequal battle against death is also shown to be an eternal cycle that all of these people face in their daily existence. It repeats itself through generations, and the play brings out the fragility of the human condition and existence and suggests that the everlasting rule of death can only be responded to with the sort of calm resignation that Moria finally arrives at the end of the play. The play has four major characters: Moria, Nora, Kathleen, and Bartley. Each of the characters is shown to be struggling to perform his or her duty towards the family. Kathleen and Nora are the first characters to be introduced on stage. They are represented as girls who are sympathetic, hardworking, and caring, and perform their domestic duties assiduously. When Nora and Kathleen realize that the bundle of clothes recovered from the corpse in Donegal might be Michael's, they take care not to open it in spite of the fact that they are anxious about their brother. They fear that Moria will walk in on them and be even more distraught than she already is. They also take care to speak very softly so that Moria gets some rest and sleep. They are also very attentive towards the needs and requirements of their brother Bartley, who is about to set off to the Galway fair. Thus, they bake a loaf of bread for Bartley in spite of the fact that they have very little turf left over. Moria, the old mother, is also shown to be someone who is very caring and kind, but at the same time riddled with anxieties and superstitious beliefs because of her fears that her last surviving son might also die on sea. Thus, when Bartley makes his appearance, Moria tries entreating him not to go out to the sea, but fails to do so. Her presentiments and fears represent an older wisdom that the young priest does not seem to possess. It is her intimate knowledge of, as well as her fear of the sea, that makes her presentiments almost visionary in nature. Bartley, on the other hand, is shown to be a dutiful son. In spite of the fact that he does not listen to Moria's entreaties, he does not also retort. He knows that he has to step out in order to make both ends meet as the only surviving man in the family. He is also caring and affectionate towards his sisters, which is why he issues them instructions about their domestic duties in his absence. Also, when Moria tries to bless him and give him the bread on his way, he blesses her instead and says, "God bless you." There's another character in the play, the sea itself. The sea is never seen but is always heard, always spoken of. It's an unseen presence that looms large in the consciousness, in the actions, in the words, and in the thoughts of all the human characters in the play. Not only is Bartley willing to risk his life in order to provide sustenance for his family, he is also caring enough to give them hope of his return, in spite of the fact that he is fully well aware of the risks that he is running into in going out to the stormy sea. The atmosphere of the play is somber from the very beginning. The first conversation that takes place between Nora and Kathleen is in hushed tones, creating a sense of fear and foreboding. From the very beginning, death looms large on the scene as characters who are either missing or are already dead are being talked about constantly. There's also the fear that those who are alive might be lost to the sea. The bundle of clothes that Nora brings in is actually a material reminder of the constant presence of death in the lives of these poor islanders. It's also a theme that's constantly present in the consciousness of all the characters. It becomes evident from the very beginning that the sea drives a very hard bargain with these poor villagers for the sustenance that it provides them. The constant presence of the sea is also indicated through auditory signals like the roaring of the waves, the blowing of the winds, which we get to hear if we watch a performance of the play on stage. These visual and auditory signals represent a world that is very intimately connected with death. The minimalistic stage decor, where only a few props are employed, also indicates the hard, poverty-stricken lives that these islanders lead. The visual and auditory background of the stage is therefore one that induces the possibility of tragedy. This possibility turns into a premonitory mood with the entrance of Moira on stage. While she tries to entreat Bartley not to go to the Galway Fair, he refuses to listen to her, not paying heed to her advice. Her prediction that he is going to die just like the rest of them is one that turns the possibility of tragedy almost into a certain prediction. When Moira fails to give Bartley the bread and her blessings and returns instead to declare that she has had a terrifying vision of his red pony being chased by the grey mare, her premonitory mood turns almost into a tragic declaration. Soon, as the villagers come keening and lamenting over the death of Bartley, this mood turns into a funereal atmosphere. The keening of the villagers is a ritualistic act that represents the normality, the fearful regularity of death in these poor islanders' lives. Finally, Moira attains a state of calm where all her passions have been spent, and she declares that no man at all can be living forever and we must be satisfied. This mood of calm is tragic in its import because it comes only after there's no more capacity left in her to mourn, because she has lost all her sons, all the men in the family. Moira's presentiments present throughout the play are not merely the effects of a superstitious mind riddled with anxiety. They are also the presentiments of a person who has very intimately encountered the sea in her personal life. Therefore, the atmosphere of suspense is one that is almost already rife with the possibility of tragedy. It's not a question of if Bartley will die, it's only a question of when, and Moira knows this well. As a result of this, the premonitory tone of the entire play is one that creates an atmosphere that is already grim with despair. The minimalistic use of stage props is a dramatic device to suggest that ordinary objects in the lives of these poor islanders also assume great symbolic significance in the face of the grim reality of death. Thus, the spinning wheel that Kathleen is seen to be using at the beginning of the play may be said to symbolize the cycle of life and death. When Nora enters the stage with a bundle of clothes retrieved from the dead body in Donegal, Kathleen stops to spin. Similarly, again when Moira returns after having had the frightful vision of Bartley being chased by Michael, Kathleen leaves her spinning wheel. The spinning wheel, which is an instrument of sustenance in the lives of these poor folks, can also thus be seen as a wheel that represents the circle of life and death. Both of these crucial junctures in the play, the spinning of the wheel stops, symbolizing a break in the normal order of existence, both on literal and a figurative level. The presence of death in the lives of these islanders is suggested by the things that the dead leave behind for those who remain alive. Thus, Michael's stick is a painful reminder of his absence, and Moira observes that in this world, it is the young who leave behind things for the old instead of the other way round. In fact, life and death are so intimately intertwined in the world of the Aran Islanders that the extremely harsh conditions of survival make everything into a symbolic object. Thus, when Bartley uses some of the rope that was meant for lowering Michael's coffin into the grave, the simple act of riding a horse is overshadowed by the possibility of tragedy and death. Again, when Nora and Kathleen observe that Bartley has put on Michael's shirt, the tragic fate of Michael becomes interchangeable with Bartley's, and it almost becomes a certainty that Bartley is going to meet the same fate as Michael. Similarly, the wooden boards that Moira has purchased for making Michael's coffin are ultimately used for making Bartley's coffin. This sort of tragic interchangeability of fate, of death, is something that gives symbolic import to these ordinary objects in the lives of the Aran Islanders. At the end of the play, the bread that was baked by Kathleen and Nora for Bartley is ultimately given to the men who are responsible for making his coffin and digging up his grave. This sort of interchangeability of fate, of things that are supposed to sustain people but symbolize death, is something that makes every object in the play of great symbolic value. The symbolic value of each of these objects represents a material continuity between life and death. Things that the dead used to possess are transferred on to the ones who are alive, and the fate itself is interchangeable. Thus, the symbolic value of things represents the eternal cycle of life and death, which is transferred on from one person to another in their endless encounters with the sea.